Hey everyone, today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada, also known as Orange Shirt Day, a day for the children who never came home. And if that sounds like ancient history, consider this. The last residential school in Canada didn't close until 1996. And for many of us, that was in our lifetime. In this video, we're going to look at the history, the consequences, the truth, and how Canada can move on together toward repair.
Because how can we come together if we don't understand it? Truth and Reconciliation Day asks us to stop, to listen, and face the history that was buried.
It honors survivors, their families, and the children who never came home from residential and day schools. Orange Shirt Day was inspired by survivor Phyllis Webstad, whose new orange shirt was taken on her first day at a residential school. Her shirt became a symbol. Every child matters. Because for over a century, Indigenous children across Canada were ripped from their families and forced into residential schools. More than 150,000 children. Many of them never came home.
This isn't a day off, it's a day on. It's when we listen to survivors, we learn about our real history, and commit to action the other 364 days of the year. And yes, it's federal. Many workplaces and schools mark it with learning, reflection, and community events. The point is to understand and then do.
Here's our truth. We grew up while this system was operating. The last federally run residential school closed in 1996. And yet, we didn't learn about it in school, and we didn't even hear about it on the news.
We lived near reserves. We'd stop in for gas, but we didn't understand what the communities were living through because Canada didn't teach us. And that's not just embarrassing, it's wrong.
And it wasn't until we worked with Ontario Tourism in 2012 when we met elders, we listened to guides, and we heard survivors' stories. And then and only then did we understand the scale and impact of what residential schools had on the community. The silence that we grew up with cost lives, languages, and trust, and touched nearly every Indigenous family in Canada.
So let's talk about the history and what happened to the Indigenous peoples, and why today is such an important day of recognition in Canada. For more than a century, the Canadian government, under the authority of the Crown, via Parliament and Cabinet, and through the Indian Act, created, funded, and enforced residential school systems legally. It was largely administered by churches.
Residential and day schools were not about education, they were about assimilation, separating children from family, language, land, and ceremony. Kids were forbidden to speak their languages, had to have their hair cut, and their names were replaced with numbers.
Abuse was widespread, physical, emotional, and sexual. They were neglected. There was hunger and disease. Thousands of children died and many were buried in unmarked graves.
The harm didn't stop at the school doors either. Families were broken, languages nearly silenced, and trust in institutions shattered.
And this wasn't one school or one decade. It was a network across provinces and territories. In the 1960s, thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families by child welfare agencies in what became known as the Sixties scoop.
These children were taken and placed with non-Indigenous families, sometimes across the border or even overseas. They were cut off from their roots, their culture, their language, and their communities. Survivors talk about growing up without knowing who they were, the trauma it carried forward. So let's name it clearly. The TRC said cultural genocide.
And the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls went further. It concluded there is an ongoing genocide and called for action.
It's a shameful part of our history, and we don't learn by looking away.
We Canadians need to own what happened and take responsibility. And to move forward, there has to be truth, repair, and real redress.
And that means accountability. Here's what Canada has done. And what still hasn't been done.
Now, Canada eventually apologized and settled lawsuits, but the damage runs deep. Today, the legacy shows. It shows up in overrepresentation in foster care, health gaps, housing insecurity, and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
This is the context for Truth and Reconciliation Day, not the past tense, the living present. Remember, these schools were operating well into the 1990s, so that trauma is still fresh. Apologies matter, records matter, resources matter. But accountability is measured in outcomes. Communities are still struggling with clean water, housing shortages, and many other things.
And Indigenous are still struggling with language revitalization. There are too few fluid elders and not enough immersion teachers. They're still striving for safety and self-determination.
So what did Canada do to apologize and pursue accountability? Well, survivors did lead the way. Through testimony and lawsuits, they forced Canada to face the truth. In 2006, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement created compensation processes and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
In 2008, the Harper government issued a formal apology to survivors and their families. But that came only after lawsuits and after survivors fought for recognition. It wasn't just handed over, it was demanded.
From 2008 to 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard thousands of stories and testimonies and issued 94 calls to action. It was a roadmap for change.
Some of these steps were put into action. There is now language funding, and there's searches for former school sites, the curriculum changes, and there's commemorations. But let's be honest, most of these calls are still sitting on government shelves. Apologies mean very little without action.
And many calls to action remain unfinished, especially around child welfare, justice, health equity, and implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in full.
Rights on paper need accountability in practice. Accountability starts with truth and full access to records and real ownership of the harm that was made.
So let's talk about the other half of the story, the Catholic Church and accountability. Because policies didn't act alone, institutions did.
And the Catholic Church ran the majority of schools, roughly 2/3 that were funded by the federal government. For decades, church leadership deflected or minimized responsibility. Survivors kept asking, where's the apology? Where are the records? And where's the accountability?
In 2021, Canada's Catholic bishops finally issued a national apology. They also launched a $30 million Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. In 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada on a pilgrimage of penance and apologized for the church's role in residential schools. Now, many people welcomed it, but others said words must become action.
Then in 2023, the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery, the old ideas that were used to justify colonial land seizure. Symbolically, it was important, but practically, people are still asking for full records and real reparations.
Have people been charged? Yes. Some former staff and clergy were prosecuted and convicted, but accountability has been limited compared to the scale of the abuse.
And records matter for truth. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate, a Catholic missionary religious order who ran many schools, they have begun accelerating access to personal files with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But survivors keep saying, when are you going to keep going and release everything? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? When files stay sealed, the powerful protect the powerful.
The bottom line is, apologies and funds are steps, but accountability means full disclosure of records, support for searches, compensation that meets the harm, and concrete changes that Indigenous communities themselves lead.
So how do we heal an entire generation?
Well, healing starts with not looking away, with listening when survivors speak, even when it's uncomfortable. It's also about more than words. Communities need clean water, safe housing, proper health care, and resources for language revitalization.
And justice matters too. Acting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, it's needed. And implementing the UNDRIP solutions not as slogans, but as laws, budgets, and accountability. Addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It needs to be done with real prevention and community-driven solutions.
Also, land and self-determination matter. Honoring treaties, supporting Indigenous governance, co-creating solutions instead of imposing them.
And what do the rest of us do? Well, we need to show up and we need to learn whose land we're on. We need to support Indigenous-led organization and attend events. We need to read, learn, listen, donate, and volunteer.
Reconciliation isn't a one-day thing. It's an everyday thing. It's how we vote, how we talk, and how we show up. And we only get there if we walk it together.
So today we wear orange not just to remember, but to commit. Commit to the truth, commit to change, commit to reconciliation. Because every child matters.
And if you want to help, in the description, we've listed Indigenous-led organizations that you can support today.
And you can write and demand action to your MP. Write them and say, I support full implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to fund clean water, housing, and language revitalization.
And to church leadership in your area, tell them, release complete residential school archives to the NCTR. And fund survivor-led healing and searches.
And if you're a survivor or a family member or know someone who needs support, the 24/7 crisis line is on the screen. You're not alone.
So today, talk to your neighbors and your friends. Start the conversation. Share this video with someone who needs to understand and learn.
And let's move forward together with Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians side by side toward a real repair.
Links to learn, donate, and take action are in the description. And remember, every child matters.